All right, you are now in week or module 6 of EDLR 7323, and by now, hopefully, as noted in the introductory video of this class, this document that you see has become very familiar to you. And by this time in the class, you've now covered all of the key content that relates to these different boxes on here. You've already submitted a draft or two of this document in which you've clearly articulated the problem related to your topic, and you've justified it. You've created a clear and concise purpose statement, or the aim of what you hope to do or plan to do in your research study. You've developed at least a research question that mirrors this purpose statement and clearly articulates between the purpose statement and the research question what you're planning to do, who you're planning to study, and how you're planning to do it. So the who, the how, and the what that you're planning to look at in your study to make it clear to your reader. You've also started thinking about this idea of sampling and how does a sample represent kind of that target population, and what are some different methods for sampling. You've learned about variables and what a variable is and how to think about measures to actually systematically measure what you're trying to capture in that variable. And in the last couple of weeks, you've learned specifically about 3 in particular, quantitative research design. You've learned about experimental and quasi-experimental research designs. You've learned about correlational research designs, and you've also learned about descriptive research designs. And so those 3 research designs probably have become more familiar to you now. And so this video is really just to, as this week you will be submitting kind of your final draft, so to speak, before the end of the class, final project of this document. And it's just important, just a reminder that it's really important that the things that you're articulating between your purpose and your research questions and your design are all connected. So for example, if the purpose of my study is to describe something, describe some variables, hypothetically, maybe I want to describe teachers' perceptions of students' behavioral issues in high school settings, just hypothetically. And I've developed a solid research question that might be, what are teacher perceptions of behavioral issues evident in high school classrooms? And then we have our design. We have to make sure, okay, what have I just articulated in my purpose and research questions? I'm trying to describe something. I want to kind of state the perceptions, the characteristics of those perceptions, describing those perceptions. And so my design should reflect that. In that case, it would be a descriptive design. It wouldn't be a correlational or an experimental research design, because that doesn't address what I'm trying to do, which is to describe a current situation. Hypothetically, if my purpose statement had been, how do general education and special education teachers, or how do teachers and parents' perceptions of behavioral issues in high school settings differ, or for a research question, what are the differences in how special education teachers and general education teachers perceive discipline or behavioral issues in the high school classroom? That leads me to something that isn't descriptive anymore. Now I want to compare 2 groups. So my design, I have to make sure, and from a design perspective, I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to need to do probably an experiment, in this case, a quasi-experimental design, because you're not assigning individuals to a group. They're pre-existing groups, general ed teacher, special ed teacher. So you have a clear design. And so it's really important as you're building these pieces that you remember that they all flow together, that they're not in a silo. They don't operate independently of one another. So at this point in the class, and hopefully you've gotten some good constructive feedback from the instructor on each of these elements, and even elements of the sample and variables and measures can impact the design, and the design can also impact those things. So for example, if I'm doing a group difference study or an experimental or quasi-experimental design, that has some implications for how I'm sampling and who I'm going to sample and how. Similarly, if I'm going to do a descriptive study, there's different ways in which things I'm trying to describe. Is it going to be through survey research? Is it going to be through some type of other maybe archival data that already exists somewhere that I'm collecting or using. And so based on my design is going to influence, okay, what types of measures, how am I going to measure this particular variable that I'm interested in. So the big picture really at this point is you should be at a point where you've progressed through each of these, and you want to really, the key things to really make sure is that when somebody sees your purpose statement and your research question and you articulate the design, that there's a clear connection between all of those. It's very clear that this is a descriptive study or a correlational study or an experimental study. And the last thing I want to say about that is, and to not get too specific, but there are times when you may have multiple designs, so to speak. So in some cases, you may have a study in which you're really interested in describing a certain situation or certain outcomes on certain variables kind of broadly, but then also kind of beyond that, you have maybe a couple of different groups that you're trying to compare related to that. So maybe you have a kind of a descriptive element, but also an experimental or quasi-experimental element. So it's important to keep in mind that it isn't rigid, that you can only do one. There's sometimes a mix of multiple designs kind of woven in. Again, all goes back to what is your purpose. If your purpose has multiple pieces to it that require multiple types of designs, then it has to be clearly articulated. And so again, the goal at this point and for this week with your assignment is to make sure that there's a clear link between each of these, and particularly the purpose to the research question and the design that you're going to be choosing. So hopefully at this time, this has become a bit demystified since the initial part of the class. But again, it's just important to remember that cohesiveness in order to, again, build that solid foundation for your study moving forward, and for you to determine the specific methods that need to be done in order to carry out the particular study.